Should I clap? I'm very good at clapping.
Well, you're the chef. Hooray!
So, we're gonna talk a little bit about hunting, and I think that everyone who wants to walk with us and listen and maybe ask some questions, you can come out to the tent, and you can actually stand down here below us.
We're gonna play this walk and talk concept the same way as we do when we hunt. We have a brilliant plan. We're probably not gonna follow it. It will probably turn into something else. And that is the hunter-gatherer way. You can't plan like a farmer. You have to play it by ear. And first of all, I think we might just introduce each other.
Yeah.
Magnus Nilsson, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Magnus, and I run a restaurant called Fäviken, which is located. We usually say it's located in like North Sweden, but it's only really halfway up. But no one really understands where it is if we don't say North Sweden. So it's about 1,200 kilometers north of here. Fäviken is located on a big private estate in the Scandinavian mountain range. The estate is 20,000 hectares, and we grow a lot of our produce ourselves. We've had gardens for over 10 years, and a big part of what we do is also to work with meat that's provided from the forest, game meat. And it's quite unique for a restaurant in Europe, really, what we do, because we not only have control of our own land at a quite large scale, but we also have all of the facilities needed to legally work with game and to do it in a hygienic way. So, in about 1 week, we had grouse hunting premiere was yesterday. So from about 1 week and until mid-November, pretty much all of the meat that we will serve will be wild meat. So that's me. I've been hunting for a long time. I've been hunting for over 20 years. I never hunt for Fäviken, which everyone thinks. Everyone thinks that I just go out and shoot everything that we serve, which is not the case. But I grew up hunting, and it's a big part of my sort of identity as a person and a chef.
I'm really sorry to hear that you're not the guy shooting all the game in Fäviken. My name is David Carsten Pedersen. I have a radio show on Radio 24/7, the best radio channel in Denmark. It's called Hunting License. Where we take famous and infamous people hunting every week. And I've been hunting for 20 years as well, maybe more actually. And
legally for 20 years.
I've been hunting since I was 16. And I run a hunting school in Copenhagen. I work with a lot of chefs and try to change the way that we think about game and how we think about hunting and how we think about meat. Because from my point of view, as a hunter, I grew up with the fact that you looked your meat in the eye. I know where my food comes from. And I have known that since I was 3 years old and saw my first rodeo shot next to me by my dad. And I know that this might sound like a crazy concept to some people, but I just had a daughter 3 weeks ago, very happy, actually a month ago now, and I will bring her hunting as well. It's very important for me that she gets her hand bloody as fast as possible, because then I will never have the question, Dad, does the meat come from the cooler? No, it doesn't. Something lived in order for you to eat that steak. And it doesn't matter if it's a cow or chicken or whatever you buy, whatever you use in your restaurants, something died. And I think from a hunter's perspective, I think what we want to talk a little bit about today is conscious eating meat. How to look your meat in the eye, how to take something of our moral standards. It's funny that we as hunters stand here and say everybody else should have higher moral standards, right? Because we're the evil guys. How to take some of the hunter-gatherer standards and use them in the kitchen, use them in the restaurants, and use them in your own mentality towards meat. I think that we might head off because
and
we
also
have a hunting band
the idea of this was that we were going to sort of walk around and talk, and I don't think that's going to work because no one is going to hear what we're saying. So I think that what we're going to do is that we're going to walk into the forest. Maybe you had a little spot where we could be.
Yes.
And then we'll stand still again, and we'll make like a nice tight semicircle, even tighter than this, and then we'll start talking again. And I mean, if anyone has any questions or any sort of points of discussion that you want to bring up, feel free to do it, and we'll sort of attack it from there.
And before we start, I just want to know, is anyone here morally opposed to the fact that we kill animals, I wouldn't say for sport, but that we are hunters? Anyone? Every time I do something like this, I ask that question. I always expect a forest of hands. Never happens. It's weird, eh?
It's because people don't dare saying it.
Yeah.
But let's follow David.
Good.
Yeah.
Those of you who don't work in forestry, anyone here works in forestry? Good, because I can say loads of stuff. When you look at this forest, a lot of people will think, but what I'm looking right now is nature. It's nature in its purest form. It's free. It's untouched.
This area is the same as a cornfield.
This is the same.
Yeah.
This area is as cultivated as Christian's field. There is absolutely no difference except that this has been around for longer. Someone has planted it. It's planted in rows. It's the biodiversity level in a forest like that is not very high. And the funny thing is, same thing goes for this. The beech forest is also planted and it's been taken care of. And this is lumber production. This is IKEA. This is what happens with IKEA furniture before it becomes IKEA furniture. The Swedes. It's just to give you an idea that when we talk about nature in a Scandinavian setting and in a Danish setting, it's highly cultivated. But we have the opportunity to actually to take something that's cultivated and rewild it. And a lot of the things that I've seen with the way that hunting has changed over the last 20 years is that we have rewilded our hunting culture, I would say, and we've probably also rewilded our national culture. In Denmark, it used to be when I was a kid in Denmark. If I said I was a hunter, if I came to school with my barber jacket, remember oilskin jackets used to be not very cool.
In Sweden, no hunters have barber jackets.
No, and the reason is
it's like fancy counts and
it's a
things
crappy product. But that's what I had when I was 13 and I hunted with my dad and I had blood on the back because we were carrying a deer out. It's not the way you carry a deer out. And I would get teased because I was a hunter and you're not supposed to be a hunter and that's wrong. Whereas now, we just talked about every time I walk into a bar and I said to people I run a hunting school, people will ask me for a number and, oh, can I get the license? And I really want to hunt. And there's been a big change. And one of the reasons is the chefs.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe it is here. But I thought about what you said before, that every time you do an event like this, you ask if someone in the group is morally opposed to hunting. And I was thinking to myself that I never ask that, actually. Not because I don't find it interesting, because I mean that can be interesting and it's always interesting to have opposing views and have a discussion and so on. But I think it also says a lot about different backgrounds in hunting, where you describe a background which is very different from mine. Because growing up in northern Sweden, hunting is just part of everyone's day to day. There's not a single person who lives there who doesn't know someone who's a hunter. So it's completely different from the more densely populated parts of Europe. And the more densely populated parts of Europe, which I think we can count Denmark to, hunting has more of the terrible word sport that's used in English about hunting, which is like such a dumb thing. Sports is football and stuff like that, not hunting. But I think that sort of inflicts a lot of problems into people's way of watching, like looking at what hunting is. Whilst in northern Sweden, that's not the case, because hunting there, it comes from a perspective of sustaining yourself and your family and the community. And I think it all boils down to us having a lot more space. Because like where I grew up, Jämtland is one of Sweden's regions. It's geographically pretty much exactly the same size as the whole country of Denmark. And there's 100,000 people living in Jämtland. There's not that many of us. 45,000 of them live in a city in the middle of the region, and then the rest are spread out over that whole area. And growing up there, a farm, for example, where your family has lived for a couple of generations, it's normal that has 1,000 hectares of forest attached to it. So we just hunt in a different way. And I mean, I grew up having not eaten beef really until I was in high school, because we ate moose. And I think that this sort of perspective of hunting as a way of getting meat to your family, a way of interacting with community, and just a very, very natural part of everyday life. It doesn't make that whole discussion redundant of the moral side of it, but it makes it less apparent. So I never really thought about even asking that. I mean, it just says a population of 10 million. There's 1 million people who has the opportunity in Sweden to hunt for moose, and most of them do it, not every year, but on a regular interval. And that says like a lot about how deeply ingrained it is in our society.
I think it's very interesting that we have this this schism, because when you think about hunters, you think about pretty much the same culture. Even from my side, when I think about hunters, and where for you it's very ingrained in the culture. It's almost taken for granted. When the moose season opens in northern Sweden, everything is closed for 2 weeks. I've been there.
First week of September, it just shuts down.
Yes, just forget about it. The gas station will be open, and the pizza
on
place
self-service.
On self-service, because no one's there, and just leave the money or don't. We don't care. Whereas, and I've experienced the same thing in New Zealand, where you also have very much a culture where areas where you live off the land. Whereas in Denmark, we're probably at the fault line between the highly between those cultures in Europe that has distanced themselves from nature the most. Like you have the German industrial society, you have all the way down south, and then we lie on that weird fault line where on one side we're this polished, politically correct, industrialized society. On the other side, we have 175,000 Danish hunters. And this tiny country, we're not even we're the size of Jämtland. And it's embarrassing. And it's just interesting how hunting has become such an integrated part of our generation, even though it's like a counterculture almost to buying your meat in Netto.
But don't you think that's also like part of what brings a new interest to what you do with the hunting school and all of that? That it is a counterculture in a way. I mean, it has never been a counterculture before. Now perhaps it is for some people at least. And I mean, I see this as well. I don't, I was over exaggerating it a little bit before, but I mean, I see this too, and I see a big interest, especially when you move outside of the rural communities. There is a bigger interest now than it used to be, and there are more people from social groups that perhaps didn't grow up hunting that are now getting their hunting licenses, finding a place to actively hunt, and sort of. I think it's like there's also, I know a lot of people who get their hunting licenses, but they have no intention to ever hunt, just because it's not something they want to do. But it's a very interesting little education to get about how nature works, and create understanding for yourself.
Just experience this whole, talking a little bit more about this culture idea is, for me, the move where a lot of urban Danes, men and women, very important, men and women, decide that they want to start hunting. They want to learn how to kill their own food, basically. I see that counterculture is also represented in a place like this, because 100 years ago, if you invited everybody out, say, hey, I want to show you how to plow, they'd be like, I can't do that because I'm plowing. Like, we all know this. You have Thomas Laursen, who is picking herbs in the forest, and he's become very famous for being an expert in picking herbs. He says, well, 120 years ago, I would just be another guy down the road. Like, everybody knew how to do this. And it's because we've forgotten it that it's become fashionable, that it's become interesting. It's because we moved away from something that we know is in our blood, it's in our way of life, or how we want to live our lives, and it makes sense to us. But we've been transported away from it for so long that we started to miss it. When you have your restaurant in Fäviken, that's probably, as a location, is probably the most crazy location for a restaurant at your level.
I don't know.
You could put it in Greenland.
No, I don't think you could. I mean, it's less crazy than people think, because it's just 20 minutes away from Åre, which is a big ski town. So there's a natural flow of tourists in that region. And in the very beginning of Fäviken, that was what sort of kept us going financially. And then now we have our own customers, of course, traveling and so on. But I think that the more interesting thing with Fäviken as a location for running a restaurant, it's actually that it is located in this vast private estate. There's 20,000 hectares of owned land, both forest and mountain, and then there's another 24,000 hectares of land that the family leases for hunting purposes. So I mean, it's almost 50,000 hectares of land that we are just in the middle of, and that sort of provides an opportunity to work with produce in a way that almost no other restaurant can do. Because when I came to the place, there was already a fully licensed facility for handling game, making it legal to serve it, which is very rare because, you know, and this also has to do with our culture in Sweden of hunting coming from a sort of sustenance perspective, that you can't really buy game. You can't call like a meat dealer and ask to buy grouse, because then it will come from Scotland, because there's no one sells their grouse.
What's the kilo price of moose in Sweden?
It's very low.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you buy it on Blocket, which is, you know, like Craigslist in Sweden, you probably, you always buy like the whole animal. You can't buy a kilo of moose meat.
And how big is a moose, just for those who don't know?
I mean, it can be like butchered weight 400 kilos if it's a really big one. But you buy, you know, you pay 50 krona a kilo if you buy it as from a private individual. But no one sells their moose. I mean, it's like when my dad hunts, for example, it's like it's him and 10 more people. And they hunt on about 4,000 hectares of land. That is a mix of land that they all individually own and a bit of land that they lease as well from a big forestry company. And they have a license for 15 adult moose and a whole bunch of calves. So every year, I mean, each family gets a moose and a half. And, you know, that's the reason why. I mean,
that's about 500 kilos of meat.
Yeah, no, like it's 300 without the bones, roughly.
Okay.
But
still,
you know, that means that like my family growing up, we had all the moose meat we wanted to eat in a year. We, you know, gave it away to our extended family, and that's what we actually ate. Like when we had meatballs, that was what it was made from. And my grandparents, they had a dairy farm, so they had, you know, cattle, but we didn't eat them. We just sold them. You know, we just ate moose instead.
Would you prefer moose to beef?
I mean, it's two different things to me, but I mean, moose is very tasty, and for me, it also has there's an element of childhood nostalgia to it as well. So, I mean, I wonder maybe someone else wants that, you know, because we've been babbling for like a while now, and it can go on forever. So, I mean, maybe does anyone have a question on this? Don't be shy.
I have one thing that I would love to ask you while you were thinking about your question.
Because if no one puts up their hand voluntarily, I'm going to point on someone, and you have to ask a question. Yeah. So.
Good. That was a question. Good, Ilya.
Can you learn hunting in one place and then just fly to another country and hunt there with the skills you got, well, in Denmark, for example, and then go to Siberia and hunt something there?
I mean, if you
yes.
Yeah.
the quick answer is yes.
Yeah.
But I've hunted in Sweden quite a lot. When I go to Sweden, I feel like a 16-year-old again, which is nice, because I don't know the land, I don't know the ground, I don't know moose hunting, I don't know the tracks, I don't know the techniques, I don't know the people, I don't know the dogs. So you have to relearn. I just did a radio show in Canada where we went bear hunting, and I've never hunted a bear before. I've never had a bear in my scope. I've never eaten bear before. And getting that whole new experience also expands on your own mind. It's like as a Danish chef going to Japan, working in a kitchen. You kind of know the basic idea, and then you're totally fucked because you have no idea what you're doing. So it's pretty much the same thing, I would say.
But I think it's also, I mean, it really depends on like regulations and stuff like that. But I mean, you get a hunting license and then you get a gun license, and I think that applies to every country. And I mean, if you were to go as a guest and hunt somewhere else, you would hopefully be humble enough so that you will go with a guide and you understand the cultures and customs of that place. And me personally, I've never traveled for hunting, and for me, hunting is not it's not a pastime I do. It's like I do fishing a lot, which is a pastime. I travel for fishing. It's something that I do for fun only. It's a completely recreational activity for me. Whilst hunting for me is not. It's just part of what I do. And I've never gone on a hunting trip. I hunt at home and I hunt with friends and so on. So I think that sort of, it's very different. So I don't have any experiences myself, but I think that's the way it works.
There's different ways. I think also Danes generally travel more to hunt because again, 175,000 people and we have no land, and whereas you just have your backyard. and the more urban you get, the more you want to leave. So I think there's a big difference, and there are big difference between different countries' hunting culture. We can talk hunting culture all day. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about game meat in gastronomy. And we just have one question before we.
Yeah, I have a question. It's about game meat. As a,
Okay, cool.
as-
Yes, game meat. Go.
as a cook who cooks a lot of game, but also a hunter, do you get a different experience, and especially taste-wise, out of an animal that you know that you killed? Does that make a difference for
No,
you?
it doesn't. But I think that it could do if you're less accustomed to it. I mean, I think that for me, it's just part of the way things work. It's been part of my whole life, so I don't really think about it that way. But I think that if you come from a background where you haven't had contact with nature in that way, where you haven't, lived on a farm, seeing farm animals go to slaughter, or where you haven't grown up hunting and so on, then I think that it's definitely a very different experience.
What about fish then? That's a recreational thing for you. Do you get a different experience out
I
of
don't
cooking
kill
fish
I don't
as
kill
well?
the fish, so
Okay.
it's a completely recreational thing.
Okay.
But no, it's and I think for the restaurant though, I mean, it's something that's very special for the people who travel in and eat at Fäviken, because it's a type of meat that you just don't see elsewhere. Because when you go to restaurants, in Europe where meat from forests are served, it's usually pretty much limited to stuff that I don't even consider game. Like mallard duck, for example, that's been reared on some estate somewhere, and then they release them and shoot them, a couple of thousand of them, and then they sell them to a restaurant. It's usually that's the type of game that you would see in a restaurant, whilst for us it's animals who live their whole life in nature. And it's a huge variety as well. I mean, just we're going into bird season now, and the birds that we serve over the next few months, it would be grouse, black grouse, capercaillie, woodcock, thrush, pigeon, a whole range of birds that you very rarely ever see on a restaurant menu. And I think that's something that, I love the fact that we can offer that to our customers and that they will get it nowhere else.
I'm just getting very hungry listening to that. You all know exactly what birds he's talking about, right? With the capercaillie and the difference between the Swedish grouse and the Scottish grouse. And because this is the interesting thing. Right now, you're talking about animals that most people have absolutely no clue what the difference is, what they look like, and what they taste like. And what I found was really interesting working with chefs for the first time. And helping them to get their hands on game meat. All these different animals have the taste variation is as big as between cow and pig.
Yeah,
Of teal and capercaillie has very, very different taste. So there's a whole universe of taste that I'd say 99.9% of chefs actually never get their hands on. And it's super sad. Imagine that you only had 3 different versions of greens.
Yeah.
That's it. You can use cauliflower, you can use cucumber, and you can use whatever you want. It's the same thing. Like all you guys working as chefs, if you only work with beef or pig or maybe chicken or farm-reared ducks, you're missing out on a very, very large portion of your taste universe, and it's sad. Another thing I thought was really interesting from seeing chefs is how many people works as chefs? How many have handled animals with skins on and actually taken the skin off and actually butchered themselves? Good.
Quite a few.
Very happy. That's a very high statistic higher than it normally is, because when you have somebody, I remember Ben Reed, I saw him standing with a roe deer. He was standing with his roe deer, small deer, holding out this. He was crying. He had tears falling down his eyes because that was the most beautiful moment as a chef that he's ever had, because this is what it was about. He was going to spend hours preparing this thing instead of just getting it plastic wrapped in and like we need 10 of them, 10 of them, 10 of them, 10 of them, 10 of them.
Yeah.
And
I think this is also something that for us. It's like at Fäviken we don't buy any other meat than whole animals and whole fish, and that's been the firm standpoint of the restaurant from the first day I came there, that we only buy whole animals. So I think that and I mean, for me, growing up with that, also working in a couple of restaurants before Fäviken where that was normal, that you got feather game and a hare with pelt on and so on. I didn't think much about it in the beginning. It was just simply like a quality factor. But then you start realizing when you start employing staff that it's like no one knows how to do that. And I think that's also another beautiful thing that Fäviken has been able to give to, I mean, there's about 300 people who worked in the restaurant over the last 11 years. And it's been a beautiful thing to be able to give to these chefs that have now moved on and they do other things, is to show them like how this is done. Because I mean, there were a few chefs here, you know yourselves how, you know, relatively rare it is to even get whole fish in a restaurant. I mean, most restaurants, even very good restaurants, like get their fish filleted. And to me, that's a skill that I'm really proud that we've been able to give to a lot of chefs as well. And it comes from, I think, my background, growing up hunting and handling whole meat.
What value would you say that gives you?
I mean, it gives you, on a strictly professional level, it gives you a entirely different level of control of your product, of your end result of a dish, because you are in control of every step of the way, not just the end part. And then, on a personal level, I think that it just gives you much more satisfaction to work with something from the beginning to the end, rather than just the last third of the way.
And what? Yeah.
Question. I was curious about something you said. At 13, you ate beef for the first time, right?
I think it was when I started high school, so 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
At what age were you made aware that not all meat was hunted for food?
I mean, I knew that. I grew up on a farm, so I knew that from day one. But it's sort of a silly thing, really, because looking back, I mean, it's a little bit dumb. But when you're 15 years old and you lived your whole life at home, you think you know quite a lot about the world, and then you realize much later that you didn't know anything, And it's very easy to believe, which I think that we were all a victim of from time to time, to believe that the reality that we surround ourselves with is the reality for most people. Even on an intellectual level, everyone understands that that's not the case. It still feels like that. And I mean, I didn't grow up in some, turf hut in the deep forest of Jämtland. I grew up in a suburb to a city of 40,000 inhabitants. On a little farm. My grandparents had a dairy farm, and so it was like a very normal Swedish upbringing. But like all of these parts that are remnants of another, past society with the hunting and all of that is very present. And at the same time, I still went with my parents to a supermarket to buy groceries and so on.
You say that, but I live in Amsterdam, and there's a reverse phenomenon happening where everyone thinks a fish comes in a little block. In a styrofoam box, and when they see the entire animal, a lot of people, surprisingly high number of people, react with this icky.
Yeah.
I'd want to touch that.
Yeah.
So it almost feels like this illogic is kicking in now, where people want food in certain shapes and forms that are unnatural to its.
Yeah, absolutely, and we see it everywhere. I mean, I see it around myself as well, and it's a very strange thing, because it's not just like an uneducated way of looking at things. You can see it in all like segments of society, in all social groups. There is a movement towards that, which is very sad. But there is also the counter movement, which manifests in things like what David said, that more and more people are like, he goes to a bar and then 5 people wants to go to his school, So I think that it's sort of a little divide. And that's probably the way things work.
I think there's a very high level of that we as a society has our lives, and we live such complex lives where we feel so divided from where the actions are taken and the consequences to our lives. Like the fact that most of us have absolutely no power over our own economy. We're hired by somebody who pays us wages. If the restaurant closes down, it's not your fault, but you're still gonna get fired. If some guys decide to come over and wants to buy Greenland, it's also not your fault. But like there's so many things happen. If some idiot decides to burn off the Amazon, I can't change that. I really can't change that. So I think there's a movement toward compartmentalizing all the things that you really can't handle. And one thing you can't handle is we've been brought up, our generation before us was brought up by the fact that death is always wrong. Death is wrong. You're not allowed to kill. Thou shalt not kill. is inbred in our society. The nice people in the 60s were very keen on that you're not allowed to kill, and that's totally okay with me, that's fine. But you're gonna get very hungry at some point, because death is a part of life. Even though if you're a vegan, even the production out here, mice dies, worms, bacteria. Death is a part of every single part of production. You cannot change this, and it's okay. We shouldn't be afraid of death. But we are so afraid of death that we have pushed it away from us into factories. We do factory farming. We hide all our pigs. In Denmark, we have 20 million pigs.
Yeah.
20 fucking million pigs living shitty lives in crappy houses all over Denmark. It is horrible. It is absolutely horrible. And the only way that we can live with this, because we all know it, when we buy a hot dog and we're drunk, we know that that pig was not happy. The only way that we can live with it, you know it's true, is by pushing it away and say, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see that farm-produced fish. If you actually see the farm-produced fish, like the ones produced in Norway and produced in Denmark and Scotland, you see that fish, that's an ugly fucking fish. It is diseased, it is sad, it's a horrible, horrible fish. So instead of confronting that you are actually a part of this chain of destruction, you like it cut out into little pieces and you like it handed over to you in little squares so you don't have to think about it. You like your pre-packed McDonald's meal because then you don't have to own up to the fact that you are eating a cow. That was a living cow. It had a shitty life, it died a shitty death, and now it's a shitty meal. But you can forget about it because it's nicely packed in a nice little package. I think that might be an explanation because otherwise it's a very dramatic reckoning when you wake up in the morning going, oh, this is the reality. Yeah. I can highly recommend that if you've never visited a Danish pig farm, do it. It will make you into a vegetarian very fast. Of course there are nice pig farmers out there, just like there are nice dairy farms, but there are very few in between.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because again, I do see that hunting and hunter-gathering has become a counterculture to that exact tendency that we like our little nicely packaged things. The same thing, we like our carrots to all be the same length. They want to buy mallards, saying, well, can you give us an estimate? How much does a mallard weigh? Says, yeah, well, I can give you like the kind of rough estimate. No, we want on grams because we know how much each portion is. Yeah. Like,
so we have a system when we buy game, because we also buy game. Not all of our game comes from the estate itself. We also have like 3 or 4 hunters that hunt for us, and we pay pretty well. And you know, it's this is something that many restaurants could never do, but it's the privilege of running a restaurant like Fäviken where you charge like a lot of money for people to come and eat. But we pay 100 krona per portion, ex VAT. And then we have a system that all of the hunters and us have agreed on what constitutes a portion. So it means that if we buy a grouse, for example, and it's perfectly shot, you can use the whole bird. It makes 2 portions. So we pay them 200 krona for a grouse. If half of the bird has too much hail in it, if they were like a little bit too close when they shot, if they didn't have enough ice in their stomach to wait until the bird was far enough away, then we only pay 100. So we pay 100 krona per usable portion. And that was for us a way of communicating with the hunters in a way that made sense. So we don't have to think about things like that. How big is a mallard? It's like we get the mallard, we show it. Well, this is a 200 krona mallard. This is a 400 krona mallard.
And that's one. I think that's the benefits from having you there and not somebody who's like, okay, this game thing sounds awesome, let's do that. Where you actually know the culture, you know what the specific animal, the value of the specific animal, because that's another thing that I'm seeing with chefs who find out, okay, you can go and pick stuff in the forest, great. You can shoot game, you can use game, great. Can we get it cheap? Because it's just grown there. Nobody paid to grow it, so it must be cheap. And the mallard, you shot it, you had fun while doing it, so it has to be cheap. I think we have to do it in your way. Yeah. We have to turn it on its head and say meat should be expensive. The better the meat, the happier the animal, the more the value. It is so important. And buying cheap should be a mark of bad quality. It should be something where if you, I know it's tough to run a restaurant. I know that it's tough to get all the resources that you need, but then smaller portions saying, okay, this teal, this is gold. You're eating gold right now. If you have a woodcock in Denmark, that should be worth more than truffles, because it's easier to get truffles, much easier to get truffles than a woodcock. But if you sell woodcock per gram, you're not going to get truffle prices. But you should, and we should start looking at meat like that. And it's okay, you say, well, then not everybody can eat at your restaurant then. No, but not everybody can eat at Noma or at Fäviken or...
I think for it's, you know, it's in restaurants like Fäviken is an anomaly. You know, it's not supposed to be an everyday meal. It's not. It's somewhere you go very rarely. And in the beginning, I felt like that as well. We were raising our prices to be able to afford better produce, to be able to afford more staff and push down their work hours and all of these things. We raised our prices, and I was starting to feel that we're like pushing people away. And then at one point, I just sort of decided that, well, it may be like that, and it may be a bit sad that not everyone can come to my restaurant because it's too expensive, but it's the way it is. Because otherwise, other people will subsidize those people who come with their time and their passion. In a way that ultimately becomes very unfair, and like for us, the ultimate proof on this came about 3.5 years ago when we decided that either we close or we start doing a 40-hour work week with 10-hour cap of overtime and paid overtime only. And to do that, we had to almost double our workforce. Because before that, people worked a little bit more, you know, more like 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
And essentially, we raised our prices from 2,000 krona to 3,000 krona overnight. And this is not something that any restaurant can do. It's very strange, you know. And I had prepared all of these like statements and, you know, press thingies and like replies, and then no one noticed. It was very, very irritating, the whole thing. It was not a single tweet, it was not a single question, everyone just kept going.
You should have raised it to 4.
Exactly.
If you pay $500 or $700 for a dinner, you thought.
But that's the easy mechanics of it. But it doesn't, when it's your place, it doesn't feel like that. Because it's a big deal, you know. And I think that, you know, it really shows that restaurants like Fäviken and many others can, you know, we can be forerunners in a way when it comes to putting a correct price on food. Because the fact is that, I mean, take milk for example. So in Sweden milk costs 10 krona per liter. It costed 10 krona per liter when I was a kid too. It's like, you know, it doesn't change, you know. And obviously it's impossible to produce, like to squeeze liquid out of a living animal and to have it, you know, treated and transported and sold for 10 krona per liter. So all that money, it comes from somewhere else. It comes from farmers not being paid and, you know, living less good lives than they should. It comes from subsidies from the European Union and the Swedish state, and it comes from many different directions. And the problem with that is not that the food gets cheaper as such. The problem with that, and with all other food groups that's subsidized either by states or by private individuals, is that it fucks up everyone's point of view on what food should cost. Because all of a sudden, I mean, you pay it anyway. You pay it to the tax and everything. So if milk all of a sudden costed 30 krona, everyone would be like, what the fuck, you know? This is so expensive for milk. But then when you start counting backwards, you realize that the true cost of food is always paid by someone anyway. And that's you know, something that I think that restaurants like Fäviken can kind of address a little bit, and we can sort of, because we have this sort of anomaly of a situation where people just travel in and pay whatever it costs, at least we can pay our suppliers like the true cost of what they want to sell us.
I think there's 2 points that I'd really like to approach. One thing is that I'm definitely a meat eater. If I don't have animal protein once a day, I don't sleep very well. I have proof. And the idea that, oh wait, meat should cost more and we have to be more environmental, have environmental conscience in the way that we eat. I had a big problem with this, and then my wife moved to Switzerland, and I moved to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, meat is really expensive, like crazy expensive. the only thing that you're allowed to take into Switzerland without paying tax is game. So I brought a shitload of game in my backpack, and they're like, so it's game? Yeah, very good. So I brought this in. But what I noticed was, when we started buying meat, I wasn't just buying meat. I was on the package, it said, was it bio? Was it free range? Was it factory farmed? Where was it produced? Was it produced in France, Germany, Switzerland? Where in Switzerland? So I could go to the supermarket, I could say I would like to buy a free range pork chop from that region of Switzerland. Boom, I could buy that. It would cost more, but when I took it home, we could feed 2 people of 1 pork chop. Try to do that in Netto in Denmark, I dare you. If you can get yourself to eat it, actually. It was amazing to experience what good quality meat, how the value of that meat was actually the same as the quantity of the shitty meat in Denmark. And when I came home, I started thinking, when you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you come into a restaurant and you say, well, do you have any vegan options? That's totally cool. I would love to be at a point in history where you could say, well, where does your meat come from? Can I have a list? What countries, not just what countries, but what countries, what food is it free range? I'm a free range-tarian. I will only eat free range meat. Do you have free range options? No, we don't have free range options. What? Why is my diet not the same value? Yes, sorry, I'm ranting. Yes.
We just were talking about today, like we have small code and we all share the same opinion on how food is and stuff like that. How do you think to communicate this message out to the broader public? Because the broader public still goes to Netto because that's what they can afford. How do you think
I think that it's very interesting because it's like you say, it's a small enclave of people who meet on conferences like this, and we go to each other's restaurants and we eat. It's like, and it's very easy to think that that's what the world looks like, and it's not at all the case. And I think that you can try as much as you want to tell the world how things should be, and it's not going to work. The only way is to do it. And then hopefully some people see it and it makes them feel like it makes sense. Because when you tell people what they're supposed to do, they usually do the other way around. That's my sort of opinion. And then about people being able to afford something. I think that, in Denmark and Sweden and all of the Scandinavian or Nordic countries, we're a very privileged population. And sure, there are definitely people who cannot afford to buy, a roe deer from you. Absolutely. But it's also about making priorities. And if you look at statistics, I don't know the case in Denmark, but I imagine that it's roughly the same. In Sweden in the early 80s, people placed, like an average family put 30% of their net disposable income on food. And today it's 11%. And people say the food is expensive and, yada, yada, yada. But we eat the same amount of calories, if not more, than we did in the 80s. So the food is actually a lot cheaper than then. And now everyone can also afford an iPhone. So I think it's a little bit about prioritizing how you spend your money, and I think that's something that you can't regulate. You just have to do it essentially.
I see this. You can have the follow-up question.
Sure. I just wanted to add on to this. Being someone who hasn't bought meat to cook myself at home for 4 years now, I only eat meat from selective sources, as unsustainable as it can sound to the general public. But I haven't consumed meat from high street restaurants since last September, for example. But I was in Slovakia last month. My friend's father killed a pig in his garden, and I had a sausage for the first time after months. And I feel it's about communicating the nutritional benefit of consuming animal products, especially when you compare wild meat versus industrialized farm meat. And working in the fine dining industry, I acknowledge the impact that restaurants like Fäviken have to the world. So how do you see yourself influencing gastronomy in terms of communicating the nutritional benefits of?
Well, I think that I'm a sort of a big believer in science when it comes to these things, and I think that if you're going to communicate something, like, it needs to be proven to be true, and that's one of these things, is that you can't really prove that for the human body it's any better eating game meat than shitty pork, and providing that the pork is not full of antibiotics, for example, some shit like that. But it's like the body is not designed in a way that it differs from one animal protein to another, and that sort of part of it is for me. I don't actively communicate that because I don't have anything to lean back on. So what I say instead is, look at the animal welfare side of it. I think that to me is like a very apparent thing that everyone can relate to. There's such a huge difference. I mean, you can have the terrible pig farm that you talked about before. That, I mean, no animal should ever be the subject of that. And I think that's a huge difference from an animal that grew, lived his whole life in the wild, and then 1 second it was sort of, flapping about, and then the next second it wasn't anymore. And so that's one part of it that I see.
We have a structural problem in Denmark and a lot of other countries as well. It's very hard to sell game because we had this idea that when you sell game, if you industrialize hunting, then you kill off a lot of kill off too many animals. But the way that hunting is regulated now makes it almost impossible. Like there's no animal that's been extinct from hunting, not even in Africa, for the last, 70, 80 years, since a carrier pigeon. That was probably the last species that got killed from industrial hunting. So from sports hunting, if you can use the English language, or sustenance hunting, that is a very sustainable way to get meat. But we have legislation that makes it really, really hard. Most chefs have no idea if they buy a teal with the feathers on, how to treat it in the kitchen. And if you ask Fødevarestyrelsen, they don't know either. Some tells you that they have to build a different kitchen.
But so, I think that's also like, it's like while a game meat can never be a significant part of the quantity of meat that's sold. It's just like by the very nature, because then there's not enough of it. So for the way I see it, that's not really a problem. The problem is that people don't know what to do with it when they get on it, and it's like I think it might be a bit, it's like, where do you draw the line on what's game? It's like, that's what we spoke about before. Most restaurants that would serve mallard duck, it would be like something that technically isn't really game.
Yeah, let's broaden the idea to say, okay, ethically produced meat. If you have free range pigs, as it is right now, it's not legal in the European Union to go out in the field and shoot one of Christian's cows. Christian would probably be pissed off as well, but we're not allowed, if we wanted to slaughter them, we're not allowed to walk out into the field, shoot in the head, and take it to the butchery. It's not legal. You have to put it in a wagon, stress it out, take it to the slaughterhouse. It's a horrible way to die.
That's actually a misunderstanding.
Yeah, but we just had a fine in Denmark. There was we're running a big case in Denmark about that.
Yeah, and we've been doing it in Sweden for many years.
It's great. Yeah. We would very much like to use that legislation because it's bullshit.
Like we have the same legislation, it's just interpreted differently. And it's the same like with game, for example. I mean, I don't know if there are regulations here that prohibit the sale of game, but I think that there is a very important thing when we speak about this. When I speak to chefs about this, generally speaking, they have questions how we do things and so on. It's like people often mix up law and regulation, and the law is absolute. It is what it is. But a lot of these sort of constraints that are put on, all of these things, they're not law. They are regulations that are put in place by civil servants, which means that you can change them. And we all have the same base to our food legislation, which is the European Food Act. And it's like, has anyone read the European Food Act? It's like this long, it's tiny. It's not a big thing, you can read, and it's pretty much what it says, is that if you commercially sell food, if you put food out into the market, you as an entrepreneur, private citizen or LLC or whatever, you're responsible for whatever health and safety hazard you might sort of subject the population for. That's sort of the end of it. And if you can prove that what you do is safe, then it's fine. And everything else, it's regulations put in place by various civil servants and authorities. So you can always work around that, even if it might be very hard sometimes.
And when we talk about working around that, from the hunter's perspective, what's really changed the perspective in Denmark, both for free range animals, because it's the same thing, free range and game and meat that's not produced under horrible conditions. apparently it's really easy to sell meat produced under horrible conditions. Who would have thought? But what's really changed is actually you guys. It's the chefs. The chefs have been leading the revolution towards better meat, more ethically produced meat, easier access to game, easier access to free range. And I've had the question like, can high gastronomy change the world? And I'm not within the sphere, so I see it from a little from outside. And a lot of the stuff that you guys do, it trickles down. I see 10 years ago you couldn't buy ramsons in Irma. Absolutely impossible. And then some crazy chef decides to use ramson in something, and then it trickled down. So the trickle down effect of what you guys do in high gastronomy, it has a very, very big effect, and it has in the hunting community as well, because we've started to actually make good food. Because we didn't use it 20 years ago, when you went on a hunt, it was crappy food. People didn't know how to cook roe deer.
We have time for one very short question, because we have 1 minute left. So if anyone wants to ask anything more, we'll do it, and then we're done.
With the legislations, I'm Australian, so a lot of Indigenous communities play a huge part of what you can and can't hunt. Is that impactful in Scandinavia? I know in Norway, but in where you guys
the indigenous population of Sweden will be the Sami population, and they have, which will be across Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. And there are certain things, like in Sweden, for example, you cannot hunt reindeer, but that's sort of it. And there are certain fishing waters that you cannot access because they're part of the privilege of the Sami population. But not really. It's not the same way as in Australia at all.
And in Denmark, I'm the indigenous population. So that's and you are. So that's fixed.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening to our babbling.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And please eat better meat.